Good morning. I guess we're probably live. We're going to be considering our work together as a synod, kind of going through some highlights from the recent report of the Coordinating Council with some visuals to bring it to life, as it were. We're going to open with a couple of hymn verses for a prayer. O Spirit of the living God, in all thy plenitude of grace, where'er the foot of man hath trod, descend on our apostate race. Give tongues of fire and hearts of love to preach the reconciling word. Give power and unction from above, where'er the joyful sound is heard. Those of you tuning in at home are going to notice we have a kind of a different format because we have a new camera in the fellowship hall, and as of today we're beginning having live people at the Bible class while still offering the online stream. There are a lot of advantages in being able to combine and have people present here in our usual place for Bible class. It's not quite the same for people at home because instead of taking whatever's on the screen and sort of overlaying it on the screen, they're actually taking video of the screen that's behind me. It may not be quite as immediate or legible, but we have to do a little compromising in order to get the best situation. So we're hoping this works well for you as we go through our work together as a church body. This year was supposed to be in June, the biennial or semi-annual convention. Every other year we have the CLC convention, and we get our officers together and board chairman and board members and the lay delegates, and they are assembled in our field house to do the synod's work. We weren't able to do that, of course, because of pandemic, COVID-19. At first, that convention was delayed until July, and then our president, along with our other synod leaders, I think wisely decided we weren't able to have that this year. It's put off until next year. I should have mentioned already, as usual, we welcome questions or comments from people who are at home live streaming. You can text my phone number and we have someone here to field those questions and relay them to me. If you're watching on YouTube Live and you'd like to type into the comments section, happy to take your comments or questions, and I'll become aware of them as we go. This is what happened to our CLC convention this year, which is your scary COVID virus. And so we're not having that this year, which makes the work of our coordinating council that much more important because they're conducting the synod's work in the meantime. That's why we're going through this, to see what we're all doing together throughout the CLC. From our president's report, I've got just a few highlights as we go of some of the comments made by our church leaders. This is from President Michael Eichstadt. Judging by the first 6 months, 2020 will be the year that many people would just as soon forget. It has been a time of upheaval, uncertainty, and isolation. Comfortable routines have morphed into a new normal. Among all the cancellations and postponements, one of the most difficult to make was the postponement of the 2020 CLC convention until the summer of 2021. It's biennial. The biennial gathering of pastors, teachers, and delegates from across the country is a highlight in our CLC life. Planning and working together on the many areas of ministry the Lord has placed before us is an exciting task, one that's deferred. So we're going to see what the Coordinating Council has been doing on our behalf. For those who may not know all about this, by the way, I'm forgetting to mention all the introductory comments. The Bible class materials that are available for you to download at home include these slides. It's basically a PDF of the slides, so if you have any trouble reading them, if you download that and have that on a separate screen, you can follow this more closely. But for those who may not be aware of how our church body conducts its business in the absence of a convention, or even in non-convention years, this is kind of how it works. Each one of these boxes is one of the CLC boards. Board of Doctrine, Board of Missions, Board of Education and Publications, the Board of Regents, and the Board of Trustees. They all do their work throughout the year. They meet at least twice a year, usually after Easter in the spring, and then in September of the fall. And then representatives from each one of these boards gets together with the president and the officers. So on Monday and Tuesday, If you were on, for instance, the Board of Trustees, you'd be working together very closely, and then on Wednesday, 2 from each board plus the officers get together to kind of put this all together, and then their report is the coordinating council report, and that's how it works. Typically, in the even-numbered years, they would bring their conclusions and proposals to the CLC convention, which governs all the work of the boards. But that's been put off for a year. And those who have been elected to these boards and elected as officers have had their terms extended for a year. So this is it's not exactly constitutional, but everybody understands we don't really have an option if the convention's unable to meet. First part of what comes up first after the President's message and the Coordinating Council report is a report from the Committee of Partners in the Public Ministry, which is an ad hoc committee that was put together to try to address the shortage of pastors and teachers and what we can do about it. And they came up with several proposals and conclusions. What they're mostly about is addressing the CLC's shortage of pastors and teachers. And in today's bulletin is one of the installments of inserts that they've been publishing throughout the church body. What's good about the public ministry? Originally a chapel address series by Professor Clifford Keeney years ago. Very well done, worth your time. And they are also about surveying ILC students about the preaching and teaching program. The results of that survey are in the Coordinating Council report, where they queried them about why they may or may not have pursued preparing for the public preaching or teaching ministry. And I encourage you to read the report for their responses. We've got, unfortunately, any one of these boards or these reports is something we could do in an entire Bible class. We just don't have time to get into a lot of the details, so I encourage you to read that. They also surveyed former pastors and teachers about leaving the ministry, those who were once pastors or teachers and are no longer, and why that is, and whether they might consider re-entering the ministry. This group has a proposal for CLC certification of teachers already serving. So if the congregation calls within their membership to have a teacher in the Christian day school, but they don't yet have a certificate of teaching, they may have the public school teaching certificate, but they do not have from ILC. It's a difficult and kind of impractical process right now for them to get that certification. This committee has a proposal to make that more accessible and easy to do. There is, on the part of the Emmanuel administration, they have some other, there are factors that they have to watch out for. They need to be thoroughly confident that people who have done this program are actually certifiable as Lutheran Christian school teachers. And so there's going to be some active discussion about just how this should be done and whether Emmanuel has the resources to be able to offer this and put it into place, because the professors have a lot of demands on their time already. There's also a very interesting proposal for a 2-year pastoral training program for second career candidates. So someone's been secularly employed but has wanted to serve in the public preaching ministry, really can't embark on 7 years of pre-theological and seminary instruction. So the question is, will we have a program where they can, through tutoring and personal study and vicaring experience, be certified for the pastoral ministry as a second career in order to fill some of the gaps when we don't have enough college and seminary trained pastors to serve. So the details of that are here, and that would have been discussed at length at this convention. It's being put off until next year. Board of Doctrine. It's page 9 of the Coordinating Council report. The Board of Doctrine is going to be charged with giving their advice on the disposition of the 2015 joint statement. Very briefly, this is a statement that's supposed to establish agreement between our church body and the Wisconsin Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, the ELS. The question is whether the 2015 joint statement addresses all the necessary issues that were the reason why the CLC first came into existence in 1959 and 1960. There are those who consider it to be an inadequate statement. There are those who consider it to be an expression of agreement on that doctrine that can be a springboard to lead to further agreement. Whether that is so is something that's going to continue to be discussed among pastors and laymen alike during the coming year and come before the next convention in 2021. So the Board of Doctrine didn't have a whole lot to say about that here because they were aware that the convention is not going to be till next summer. The Board of Doctrine thinks it'd be a good idea to have a single place where people could go to find documents that are actually adopted by the CLC, because there are plenty of others where people say this is what the CLC says, and perhaps it is, but to know what's actually been adopted by the church body and have that all in one place would be a good idea. They're going to be working on that. They're going to republish the Citto edition of Luther's Small Catechism, which has been the one that's been used the most by CLC congregations for a number of years. There were some suggestions, not a change in doctrine, but a clarification in how it's presented. And the Board of Doctrine will be working on what those edits might be. And then the Board of Publication and Education will see to the reprinting of that catechism. The colloquy process is when someone from outside our church body who served as a pastor in another church body would like to become a CLC clergyman. It has, in recent years, has become a more thorough process that spans at least a matter of, it can be done within a year, but it's stretched out between meetings with the Board of Doctrine on at least 2 separate occasions, and requires CLC membership on the part of the person who wants to become a CLC pastor or teacher, and requires some work on their part with other pastors and teachers to acclimate to our church body. We have 2 candidates right now who have applied to become CLC clergymen, a fellow by the name of Luke Willits in Fairfax, Minnesota, Jonathan Schnoes of Detroit, Michigan. Those colloquy meetings are ongoing. Questions or comments, feel free to flag me and we'll talk about them. Board of Education and Publications, you can see that they, the editors really manage the publication of the Lutheran Spokesman, the Journal of Theology, and Daily Rest, although this board has oversight of all these things and sees to some of the business management side of it as well. Including also ministry by mail. We have various CLC websites that are under the auspices of the Board of Ed and Publication, as well as the CLC Bookhouse. So, yes, sir.
Just a question about the daily rest. So for several years, there's been a listserv email, daily devotion.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if there's any overlap of that and daily rest, or are they completely separate?
They are separate. The question has to do with this publication, which comes out quarterly in printed form, and there's a CLC e-devotions that can be delivered to your mailbox daily, and that comes from a number of pastors, mostly in Michigan, and David Schaller is the editor of that, and they are completely separate. So the editor is David Pfeiffer in West Columbia, South Carolina, and it's 2 separate things. So. The Board of Regents report is the section that has to do with our mutual work in the area of Christian education on the high school, college, and seminary level here in Eau Claire at Emmanuel Lutheran High School, College, and Seminary. I just love these pictures of our good old alma mater and a big group of students from 5 years ago or so gathered together outside the academic center. So just a few comments from our current president of the institution, Professor Stephen Sippert. Like so many colleges and high schools around the country, Emmanuel experienced an incredibly abrupt alteration in mid-March due to COVID-19, whose disruption is still being felt into the summer break. It was certainly a challenging 9 weeks in March through May for teachers, students, and their parents, but not for the Lord and the power of His Word. As we await the arrival of a new professor and the leadership of a new school president, we depend, as always, on the faithfulness and loving care of our Emmanuel God, whose plans and providence for the school we seek to obtain. That from the president's report. So, yeah, they had the same distance learning situation as schools across the country did, as Messiah School did here. What's going to happen in the fall? Professor Rime, how's it going to look in the fall?
We don't know.
We don't know, he says. It's the same thing here at Messiah School. There are state guidelines that seem onerous, to use a word, meaning it's going to be difficult to put into practice. And we're not even aware to what extent the state guidelines, which definitely are going to apply to public institutions, what we're legally required to do, and if we're not legally required, what we ought to be doing and how much we can do given our limited staffing and not wanting to entirely burn out the staff in the process. So our Board of Education is working hard on trying to make those plans, as I'm sure they are at Emmanuel High School and College. I think in the report it says they want it to be as normal as possible, and everybody wants it to be as normal as possible. We'll see how it all turns out. Just a look back and a look ahead at where the enrollment is headed here at Emmanuel. In 2019 and 2020, 108. They expect somewhat of a decline to 101 full-time students in all 3 departments. In the college, of particular note, we notice we have 7 college students in the teacher education program. That is the Bachelor of Science in Education, 7 people preparing to be classroom teachers in CLC schools. In the college pre-theological department, the 4-year college, 5 young men preparing to enter the seminary. This coming year, we have 3 in the seminary itself, 1 fewer than last year. Of the 3, who's going to graduate? Do you know, Prof? Who's going to graduate from seminary in the spring? Drew Nauman will be the only graduate. Yeah, which is kind of the reason why we have the Partners in Public Ministry Committee to try to promote young people to prepare for the preaching and teaching ministry, because we have 5 active vacancies, and as that committee pointed out, we've got men serving full-time in the public ministry who are at retirement age or getting there very quickly. So we're going to have a real need to fill those vacancies. So 128 total students during this last year, a dip to 119, that is 9 fewer the coming year. That often has a severe impact on the budgeting process at Emmanuel, because 1 student means quite a loss for them in their revenue. So thankfully, we're going to see that due to the generosity of our members across the CLC and some rather large gifts lately, they ought to be able to weather the storm all right, but we'll be looking at the figures in just a little bit. Personnel. We have the retirement of Professor Paul Sullivan. That's taken place and was observed at the different closing events, mostly at a distance at the close of this year. What a faithful servant over many years, not only in the classroom, but particularly in his function as the Dean of Students. He had gifts to be able to confront problems forthrightly and with a gospel motivation, and with the Word of God properly applied. He'll be missed. Professor Dan Schoenbeck, who it was just his first year as professor last year, in his second year will become the new president of ILC. That begins, what day of the week next week is July 1? Wednesday? He starts on Wednesday. So we ought to recognize the faithful servant of Professor Stephen Sippert for quite a few years now in that capacity. He's remaining as a professor but will not be the president. That's going to be Dan Schoenbeck. Professor Mark Weiss, the professorage committee, that is the fix up and maintain committee of faithful workers to keep our professor houses in repair and renovated, has been working quite hard in order to prepare one of the professorages for Mark Weiss to move into. And he'll be serving in his first year as professor at Emmanuel as Dean of Students. He's in particular need of prayer in order to not only acclimate to his teaching duties, but also to that role as Dean of Students. The Regents for some time has wanted to have an expanded counseling mentoring program available to the students. The problem is if they have personal difficulties, it's difficult to go to someone who might be an authority figure. It's difficult to go to the Dean of Students. It's difficult to go sometimes, depending on the problem at hand, to someone who might be obligated to report this. So they'd like to have someone available to whom the students can come with personal difficulties and problems in confidence and receive some help and scriptural guidance from them. This is a role that Pastor Caleb Schaller was called to fill in addition to his duties at Messiah. He returned that call to be this counseling mentor. He and his wife Jen were asked to do this. They'd like to have a man and a woman. They are seeking another person to do this, another man and woman team to begin this mentoring counseling process as an aid to students at Emmanuel. I think it's a worthy goal. This is the Emmanuel Improvement Fund. If you give your offerings not only to your local congregation but also to the CLC, part of the general CLC funds are going to go to Regents' budget, part is going to go to Missions' budget, a smaller part is going to go to Board of Education, and some of the needs and part of the Board of Trustees. There are separate funds that you can give to directly. One is to help with repair, upkeep, some capital improvements for Emmanuel College. That's the Emmanuel Improvement Fund. You can see the list of projects that are here. The projects totaled, if they were to try to do all of them in a year, and they don't, they look forward to multiple years with these projects. A lot of them stay in the back burner for a long time. But the total cost would be $283,000. The balance right now is $22,000. So that's something to keep in mind. The Emmanuel Improvement Fund. The Emmanuel Student Aid Fund, grants and loans are made to students to help defray the cost of tuition in order for them to attend. And loans also made for room and board for dorm students. And then over time, once the person has graduated from high school, they are repaid. So eventually, if there's enough of a balance in this fund, it'll be self-sustaining. Repayments will equal the amount going out. We haven't reached that point yet. And so the Student Aid Fund is expecting contributions to that fund of $20,000 in order to make this balance so that students seeking financial loans and assistance can receive it from the Student Aid Fund. The Regents' budget for 2021, they're looking at enrollment in the high school of 101, in college 14, and cemetery, I hope not, in the seminary 3, and dormitory 53. So there are student cost increases this year that haven't happened for some time. $100 tuition increase for the year, $100 college tuition increase, $100 cemetery, I keep saying that, seminary tuition increase, and room and board remaining the same. So they've held the line on that for some time. There are modest increases this year. And by the way, for those who are preparing for the public preaching or teaching ministry, there are funds provided through an endowment fund that help defray that cost. So we're happy that that's of assistance to those preparing to service. This is a real nice drone picture of Emmanuel campus. You see South Hall and the Commons and the current gymnasium, the academic center, Ingram Hall, South Hall, and the girls' dormitory here. Of interest that isn't mentioned in the coordinating council report, but was mentioned briefly in the summary that came out in the bulletin, is exciting news about building funds that are available through a very, very generous bequest. What came across in the summary of the Coordinating Council report that didn't make the full report is a bequest that has been enough of a contribution to pay off the remaining balance on the academic center, which I think was about $1 million or a little bit more than that, with somewhat more than $1 million left over. So we're in a position of having the mortgage on the academic center be zeroed out, plus about $1 million to work with in the future. And so between now and next summer, when convention takes place, there's going to be a lot of study and architectural input about what the next building project is going to be. Candidates over a number of years for the next building project at Emmanuel would include a better gymnasium, because this, although it served us well, has only one basketball court on which teams can practice, and our volleyball teams have had an unfair advantage against visiting teams because the ceiling is so low. So there's a strong pull for a better facility and perhaps a repurposing of this building, which is showing its age as well. There's also been a strong desire for a self-standing chapel on the campus of Emmanuel. So I'm certainly not, and we're not in charge of where that's headed. There will be proposals to consider at the next convention. But we're thankful to God for the generosity of one of our fellow believers in the Synod who left this life and left a large bequest to make this possible. Yes, sir?
Do you know how that didn't make the report?
I don't know why. Well,
You asked, I read through it earlier today, and I
yeah.
did, and I missed that. That seems like
I did ask someone who's on one of the CLC boards about that, and he told me that there's a necessary delay when someone passes away and things are transferring, and you got to be certain that this is actually the funds are going to be transferred for Emmanuel's use. So at the time the report was written, this report was written, it wasn't, all the pieces were not quite yet in place. Apparently they are now. So we're confident that this money is available and will pay off the academic mortgage, and we'll have that available for building. But it was a little bit in flux at the time this was put together. I don't know why it snuck into the summary, but thankfully it's not in question now that the money is available. Board of Missions, we're changing gears here. And having been on the Board of Missions, it was some years ago before I came to Messiah, but to see the opportunities expanding and the people dedicating their lives to the spread of God's word in these foreign countries, and the people in these foreign countries who are dedicating their lives to the service of the gospel is always inspiring to me. So I was happy to give my attention to this and to put together a little visual explanation of just how far widespread and how exciting this work is. Our excerpt from the report in the Coordinating Council from the missions: the vast majority of the work being accomplished through financial subsidy to foreign fields is preparing men to be faithful preachers and teachers of God's saving word. This work is largely done through our support of seminaries, Bible schools, and ongoing monthly pastoral training seminars in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The majority of subsidy that is provided serves to reimburse church leaders for the expenses involved with the training and supervision of pastoral training efforts. The training of faithful pastors for the work of the ministry will continue to be the priority as we decide what efforts we are able to fund. Just for some of the personnel involved from our CLC called workers in order to help serve in this process of the focus of which is training of pastors and missionaries overseas. Peter Evenson, full-time missionary to West Africa. He's living in Togo, and they have begun a seminary training program there. And from that place in Togo, he's able to visit as well contacts in Ghana and Nigeria and he accompanies Todd Ullman, our traveling missionary, to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Todd Ullman is our full-time visiting missionary, and you may be aware recently of our people not being able to get into India. Todd Ullman himself was turned away. Having arrived in India, he was invited to leave because of their increasing anti-Christian politics that are going on there. Peter Evenson had been stationed in India, was asked to leave when he tried to re-enter at one point, which is why he was relocated to West Africa. On a more recent trip, there was going to be a visit by Pastor Tim Daub and David Rhyme to India. When Tim Daub was denied a visa and couldn't go at all, Pastor David Rhyme was able to go and visit. It seems as though if you're applying for a visa, if you haven't been there multiple times, it's easier to get in. If you've been there multiple times, they flag you as some sort of Christian troublemaker and you're not allowed in. So thankfully, those churches, through our past year's investment and structural help for their church bodies, are able to continue without our personal presence there. But we're praying for more opportunities to be able to assist them in person. Michael Gurath, he's the full-time pastor at Holy Cross in Phoenix, Arizona. He's also part-time missionary to Kenya and Uganda. John Hine and the Congregation of Grace Fridley had a contact and opportunities that were presented to them in Liberia, and the CLC Mission Board took that effort on, and he gets there once a year, I believe, to Liberia. Yes?
Interesting use of wording when you said that they were asked to leave. That sounds somewhat cordial. Is that the impression that you got, or was it sort of a hard-handed, get out of here? I'm curious what that.
It was get out of here, although they didn't feel physically threatened. So if, for instance, Peter Evenson spoke about getting through customs and so forth, getting to his hotel, gets a knock on the door, it's customs officials, you have to come downtown with us, and you sit isolated, not in a dungeon, but in a bare room, and they let you wait a good long time, and then finally come and tell you, you have to go back to the airport and go home. So, yeah, not overt persecution, but not pleasant. I already read that, but here's just a look at some of the seminary. This is a graduation from some years ago in the CLCI. If you may have met Juddy Benjamin, his father, V.S. Benjamin, is quite elderly and often ill now. But he's got a 4-year seminary, an introductory year, and then a 3-year seminary proper. Like 30, somewhere in the area of 30 men who are training in that seminary at any given time. So that's very active, and I have an affinity for Juddy Benjamin. He was in school at the same time I was, and he modeled his seminary after the Emmanuel College Seminary, and is doing marvelous work there. This is a picture, just an example of the kind of monthly ongoing training. For many of the congregations in the BELC, they have a mud, earth room and thatched roof church, and they take someone who's a little more biblical literate than anybody else and call them the pastor. And they might have some training, but many don't have hardly any training at all. And so the leaders of these churches get these guys in on the bus or the train or wherever they can for a couple of days a month in order to try to get some remedial training for them. And so they'll cram into a place like this. They're provided with traveling expenses, and they have tea in the afternoon and a few biscuits and maybe a meal, and then they put them up as best they can and send them home. Yes?
There's a request from online that if someone within this room asks a question, if you could recap it because they can't hear.
Okay. I've been trying to do that, but I'll make sure and do it. Yes, sir. Okay.
I don't remember homeside missions being notified in a long time.
Oh, yeah. Did I pass that by?
But you're like, you go back one.
You mean forward one?
There you are, right there.
Okay, that's what I missed.
Do you ever recall being that low?
No, about 10 years ago, there were 11, 12. Okay, so what happens is the stateside missions receive a subsidy from the church body, and oh, I did not repeat the question. Question is, we've got 5 subsidized mission congregations in the United States, and that's a low number for decades. That's a low number. And the reason is there is a built-in system whereby their mission subsidy is gradually reduced until they become self-supporting, and a number of them have. And in fact, Gift of God Mapleton is about to become self-supporting. Ascension Tacoma is close to becoming self-supporting. The others still have pretty substantial monthly subsidies. And so the way it's designed to work is as these become self-supporting or show that they just can't become self-supporting, and then they might just become a satellite church with a visiting pastor. If they can't become self-supporting, then they become preaching stations or dissolve. And as the number gets lower, we ought to have more opportunities to begin to reach out and even make a cold call on a community and start a mission congregation. We've had massive opportunities overseas to apply our funds and personnel in work that produces gospel witness to people who don't know Jesus. And over these years, we simply have not had little satellite congregations that say, we want to become a mission. Send us a pastor and give us some subsidy. We haven't had applications, which is why we're getting down to such a low number of stateside mission congregations. Yes?
So my question is, when you say we haven't had applications, is that due to not enough opportunities stateside or not enough men to fill?
Yeah. The reason why we don't have applications, does it have to do with lack of personnel or just lack of opportunity? We do have a lack of personnel, but that's not the reason. The reason is typically one of these starts because you've got a home church, then served by a visiting pastor, and then with that core, they want to begin a mission congregation, and we have not had that happening. We haven't had little groups applying as a core with which we can start. We have had times in the past where we said, we don't need a core of people. We need, say, a visiting stateside missionary to just go into a place and start a church. And we've tried that. And Eden Prairie has been a real active, smaller, getting to be medium-sized group and hasn't applied to be a CLC mission. I think they were prepared to call their own full-time pastor and just be self-supporting right away. I'm not sure what the status of that group is right now in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. Yes?
Weren't they at one point supported by a man Cater, and I think Doug Libby served them?
Doug Libby still is serving them, isn't he? He's preaching there. They were a daughter congregation of Berea Inver Grove Heights and began with some financial support from southern Minnesota. But they were a daughter congregation of Berea and Fridley both? Okay. So they're their own group now, and I think they're at least on the verge of calling and becoming self-supporting, but they haven't come to the mission board to say we'd like to be a mission that I know of. Okay. These church bodies that we have been supporting and assisting over the years in Asia include our 2 sister church bodies in India, the Berea Evangelical Lutheran Church in more southern India, and in somewhat further north, the Church of the Lutheran Confession of India. Nepal, we here at Messiah are familiar with Raju, who was here for several years, and they have active mission outreach hampered by the COVID pandemic, hampered by persecution and discouragement of Christianity by the government, looking to have church property and building and start a regular seminary. They've been making do with ongoing training. Bangladesh is a new contact that just recently has been declared to be in fellowship with the CLC. They've had visits and correspondence with our missionaries, and that's a new field for us.
So I have an email that says Eden Prairie is self-sustained, have not and are not intending to become mission funded.
Okay, someone who knows. They're self-sustaining right now.
Oh, there's more. They had started calling their own full-time pastor, but put on hold by COVID, intend to start back up soon.
Okay, they're doing even better than we thought. We're happy for that. Myanmar, terrible persecution. That's a difficult and dangerous place to be a Christian. And our own visitation there is limited, and according to people who have been there, you are tracked very closely by the government when you're there overseas as to where you go and what you're about. In Africa, this is where Peter Evenson lives in Togo. Across the border, there's a contact and congregation in Ghana. The group that Pastor Hine visits is in Liberia. We still have the original overseas mission of the CLC in Nigeria. It's near Port Harcourt, right there, but kind of out in the countryside. Still a seminary operating with 3 men attending the seminary. We haven't had a full-time missionary there for a long time, and it's difficult for them to keep conducting the seminary and their church body work without our presence. But the work does still go on there. Promising happenings in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Pastor Yumba, a very faithful man, who's endeavoring to begin a seminary there. In Tanzania, Martin Luther Bible College, Martin Luther Bible Seminary is had a beginning a couple of years ago that had to stop, and now it's restarted again. When our mission helpers or visiting missionaries go there, they split their time between Tanzania and Kenya, where there are a number of congregations, and they would also like to, in the future, have a seminary and have training seminars instead for the time being. A congregation and outreach opportunities in Uganda and also in Zambia. So it's quite widespread in the African continent as well. It's not mentioned here, but it is in the Coordinating Council report that we're in fellowship with a pastor in a congregation in Mexico with a couple of daughter preaching stations and men who are training with that pastor. We've been keeping up on that correspondence as well. Just a brief look at some of the personnel. Visiting missionary Ullman, missionary Peter Evenson. These are some of the district chairmen in the BELC. They're like 8 or 9 different little church bodies that are all together, each with their district chairman. This happened. Nathaniel Mayhew used to be a visiting missionary. He's on the CLC mission board. This is a convocation of African pastors and leaders who met some years ago. This is another picture of Pastor Juddy Benjamin and CLCI seminary from several years ago. Project Kinship is a kinship committee. It works under the auspices of the mission board. You may already be one who contributes monthly to help for the support of a given orphan in a number of different countries to provide for their daily upkeep and education. You might be a kinship monthly sponsor for one of these seminary students to provide for the costs associated with their training. They also more recently have expanded their purview because they get offerings, general offerings to the kinship fund. And they help with the widows of pastors who would otherwise be destitute with certain emergency aid. For instance, the recent cyclone that's gone through India and Bangladesh, for which there was emergency need for funding. So kinship does quite a bit of that humanitarian aid as well as educational aid for orphans and seminary students. Okay, the exciting part. The Board of Trustees. I tried to kind of condense some of these figures to the most important ones to take note of. Here comes our Synod budgetary figures. What happened in 2019 is the congregations decided they could commit to contributing $980,000. They received $946,000, and so we have a reserve fund that had to be tapped that year to balance out the books. What's going on in 2020, and this is going to be updated soon, Jim Sandine would want me to tell you that at the end of June comes Many congregations go by calendar years in their fiscal years. The CLC goes from July 1 through June 30, 31, 30, through June 30. So we haven't yet reached the end of the fiscal year, which is why these numbers are preliminary, but the offerings received through April are 890. The CBP estimate for our fiscal year that's just concluding is $847,000. They're projecting $1,062,000. Why is that? The generosity of not only the regular members giving their CBP offerings, but special gifts this year. Got large special gifts. We're going to come in quite a bit ahead of the budgetary needs this year, which means we make a contribution to the reserve fund so that later in a lean year we can tap into the reserve fund. Yes?
Whose budget was the mortgage payment for the academics that are coming out of? Who will save that?
The mortgage payment for the academic center is part of it's a special ILC building fund program, I believe. So the trustees manage it, of course. He's asking about where the academic center funding comes from, right?
You know what it was per month?
Per month it was like $8,000. Yeah. Okay, so we have to wind it up because we're a little bit past our time already. But, yes? Okay. What the congregations say they can give and what actually is given is what this graph is about. So when they're planning the budget, they go, okay, well, this is what the congregations say they're going to give. We typically get more, so we're going to budget for more and hope that it comes, and pray that it comes in, and it often does. See these, whoa, we're way up above the line here in these more recent years. Special offerings, lots of times, get us over the top, which should put us in mind of something, to my mind, is that as faithful Christians from a previous generation, when they pass on to heavenly glory and leave in their wills large amounts of money for us to do the kingdom work, that's great. We're also going to have to pay attention to the fact that we need a younger generation and a middle generation of people who are just as faithful, because when this older generation passes away and all the bequests that are going to come in, we still need to be able to fund all these programs at the levels which we're building up. So that's something to watch out for and pray about. For the fiscal year coming up, it was 857 for the CBP estimates, FY21, somewhat more, 866. They're expecting somewhat more than $1 million rather than that smaller number. And it's likely to come in with God's blessing. ILC revenue figures are there as well. So the year-end reserve was at 278. They expect it to be the same coming up for this coming year. So that's good to have that cushion for contingencies. What we pay our seminary professors and staff and CLC missionaries is called mission code. It was pretty pitiful back in the day when they decided we've got to do something about this. This is inflation-adjusted dollars based on that original CLC mission code in '91. This is the progress we've made in trying to raise that up to a manageable bread and butter level for our called workers. So just for an example, according to the code that's going to be in effect for this coming year, if you had been in your position for 20 years, this would be your monthly base salary, an additional $6.25 a month for each year of experience. So the annual salary for a code worker is $33,200 for a 20-year experienced person, plus the value of the housing that's provided, plus they provide some health insurance, which people don't usually figure in when they're looking at what your salary is, because employers often provide that. And $1,000 a month is what is provided, and that may not exactly cover your Obamacare plan. So the bottom line is we're paying our code workers in the area of, you add in the housing, it's a $40K kind of a job for somebody who has the advanced level of education that many of our workers do and the responsibilities that they have. That's modest. Okay, that'll keep food on the table and a roof over your head, but it's modest. And it's a good thing that we're trying to provide not only a cost of living increase, but increase that base to make it comparable to what ordinary people in our church body what their salary is, and not be disproportionately small. Okay. Yes.
There was a fine print note there that Morningstar paid off the mortgage, I think I remember that.
Yeah. Morningstar paid off their mortgage to the CEF. They've been a self-supporting congregation for a number of years. It started with an outreach effort here at Messiah. They share the Pastor Konzenbach with Millston and with Onalaska. Interesting little graph here. We try to keep in mind as a church body, what's the proportion that we of our resources do we give to education versus missions? In other words, ILC versus our missions program. This little graph shows you that it was kind of out of whack as far as ILC goes for a while. That's kind of when we're just getting the academic center going. Because these funds include the general fund, MDF offerings, kinship offerings. The ILC total includes general fund, Emmanuel Improvement, and the building. But otherwise, it's been pretty neck and neck for, we're doing pretty well at keeping a balance between our educational expenditures versus our regular mission expenditures. We also, way back in the history, the plan was the church body should be providing a good half of the cost of educating students at Emmanuel, and we're not. It's more like a third. The students are shouldering 2/3 of the cost. Good or bad? I don't know, but the institution has been relying on student revenue more than general fund revenue in increasing proportions over the years. Something from?
It's just the announcement. People are kind of dropping off here.
Okay. A reminder, Jesus said the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. We ought to be praying for that and working toward that. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And there is some announcement. Oh, an announcement. Help is needed at ILC campus this week to finish preparation of the professorage near Ingram for Professor-elect Mark Weiss, who is arriving soon. Your hands are needed to finish painting, some electrical work, and just general cleanup. Contact Ross Rail if you can help anytime this week. 715-864-1764 or rossrail@ilc.edu. If you need to get a hold of Ross and you need to use this number, I can give you that information. If you have time, please do go and help. And we'll close with hymn 504, verse 6. God from eternity has willed, all flesh shall his salvation see. So be the Father's love fulfilled, the Savior's sufferings crowned through thee. Amen. And next week we'll be looking forward to a new series with Pastor Schaller at this hour.